Hello, I'm in Stoke Newington in North London, nestled into the beautiful Abney Park Cemetery, and I'm on the way to go try find the grave of a man called William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army. Now, Booth had an extraordinary funeral. The New York Times itself said so. And he was lying in wait for 5 days, and during that time, 100,000 members of the public came to pay their respects. And then he had a memorial service which was attended by 34,000 people. And the following day, he had a funeral procession which took the 6-mile route from central London to where I am now in Stoke Newington, which was attended by an estimated 2 million people who lined the streets. And press reports at the time said that some people fainted, others were in hysterics. You had parents lifting their children onto their shoulders so they could get a better view. You had the vibrant colours of the Salvation Army, flags, hymns and rejoicing. So Booth's funeral definitely serves as a kind of microcosm to the success of the Salvation Army. It became this global institution with a network of schools and hospitals and publishing houses, reformatories, orphanages spread all across the globe, particularly actually in British colonies. But yeah, I thought starting off at William Booth's grave would be kind of a perfect jumping off point for this video, which kind of wants to talk about the history of the Salvation Army, and in particular the history of the Salvation Army in regards to its colonial legacies and activity in India. So yeah, let's go see if I can find his grave. It's not sure exactly where it is, but this is a very nice place to be. It's a very brisk winter morning, very gothic, very atmospheric, but we'll go pay our respects, and then we can think through together the colonial history of the Salvation Army. So William Booth came from rather humble beginnings, a working class family in Nottingham. He had a religious conversion experience at the age of 15, which brought him to Methodism. He was subsequently to basically ditch that, and in the 1860s he moved to Whitechapel to begin the East London Mission Society, where he began proselytizing, preaching, and trying to kind of mould the character of people living in East London, which at the time was extremely deprived. So these kind of slum dwellers that he was basically trying to convert and to bring into the religious fold. And the Salvation Army would actually target basically these vulnerable, downtrodden members of society that were estranged from the kind of conventions of formal kind of Protestant or Catholic churches. So in 1878, the East End Mission Society became the Salvation Army, and from then on in, it assumed the guise of a military order. They began wearing second-hand British Army uniforms and then subsequently designed their own. William Booth made himself the general of the organization, and a military hierarchy was replicated in a ranking system of lieutenants, commissioners, captains, and cadets. So interestingly, the Salvation Army's colonial connections were not just limited to its activities overseas. In fact, William Booth brought imperial and colonial knowledge back to Britain. So in 1890, he published a book called In Darkest England and the Way Out. In this book, Booth suggested a threefold plan in response to the high levels of poverty in Britain to inculcate the values of self-help, regularity, and self-discipline. The way he planned to implement this was through a scheme of self-sustaining communities he called colonies. First was the city colony, which would rescue the savages from the urban jungle by providing shelter, food, and temporary employment in factories and workshops. Second was the farm colony, which would relocate them to a rural site for discipline and training, situated a safe distance from the temptations of the city and the unhealthy and corrupting influences of urban life. And third was the overseas colony, where he would export people to the empire as useful settlers. And the title itself played upon the popularity of a book written by one of Britain's imperial heroes, Henry Morton Stanley's In Darkest Africa. Whereas Stanley described his expedition into Central Africa as a voyage into the heart of a dangerous and hostile wilderness inhabited by so-called uncivilized specimens of the human race, Booth takes us to the poorer parts of London, whose urban jungle and the characteristics of its inhabitants are described in astonishingly similar terms. But Booth interrupts his narrative to ask the inevitable question, as there is a darkest Africa, is there not also a darkest England? May we not find a parallel at our own doors and discover within a stone's throw of our cathedrals and palaces similar horrors to those which Stanley has found existing in the great equatorial forest? So while one certainly has to admit that Booth had a genuine interest in the poor and tried to improve their material lot, his obsession and his constant use of the language of empire basically served to widen the gap between the middle-class explorers and the inhabitants of the poorer parts of East London. And ultimately, the urban poor were put on a par with the savage natives out there in the colonies in terms of the language that was used. So, of course, such rhetoric shows the Victorian obsession with race, but it also served to render parts of England as these kind of urban contact zones that were interpreted through colonial knowledge systems. So the Salvation Army began life in India in about 1882, and initially it was pretty small scale, and they were actually viewed by the colonial government with great suspicion. They thought that these people would be troublemakers. They thought that they would basically stir up kind of religious conflict because of their aggressive proselytizing methods. But there's an interesting history of transition whereby by kind of the early 20th century, right, they became guardians of the empire. They became close companions with the colonial state. They began working more closely with them. And primarily this was actually through their ability to set up these camps for people that the colonial state wanted to control. So at the time they had something called criminal tribes, which they thought that people were hereditarily criminal, that they were criminal by birth. And this is obviously, it goes into the race science and stuff of the 19th century. But really what it came down to was control. So there was people in India before that were itinerant, nomadic, moved from place to place, lived off the land, lived these kind of different lifestyles, which for a government trying to control people, of course, isn't ideal because, you know, they're much harder to tax and to monitor. So the colonial state had these policies of forcibly settling these types of indigenous people. And the Salvation Army offered their services to the colonial state, said, look, we have these experiences of building camps and disciplining and coercing and civilizing people. So yeah, they began to work very closely with the colonial state, running these camps and controlling these people. So there is, of course, an interesting history here that actually speaks to quite a close companionship between the colonial state and the Salvation Army. So the Salvation Army began its work running these settlements for criminal tribes in 1908. And after another Criminal Tribes Act passed in 1911, the Salvation Army was put in almost exclusive charge of these itinerant communities. So these communities were confined to special settlements. And the practices of reform in these settlements were intended to transform individual characters and attributes, and mission organizations like the Salvation Army were very eager to try to proselytize to a literally captive audience. And the Salvation Army also had a commercial interest in running these settlements because they legally controlled all the produce that they produced. Now, the sad thing about all this is that the notion that someone could be born criminal was just a colonial fiction. To finish off this video, I want to talk about the actual legacies and the implications of the Salvation Army's role in forcibly settling these communities in India in camps. So I was recently reading this book about an anthropologist that spent time with one of these communities in the 1980s. The community were the Yurakulas, a kind of tribal community based in southern India. Now, when she visited this community, they were still living and working in the same settlement that the Salvation Army had originally settled them within, and were still tied to the same tobacco factory that the Salvation Army had linked them to in the early 20th century. And interestingly, the Salvation Army was still active in this settlement, although greatly reduced in their numbers and resources. They still had a presence, right? And at the time of this anthropologist's visit, they were actually engaged in a kind of struggle with the tobacco factory that were about to lay off large swaths of the community because they were going to mechanize parts of the factory. But while visiting this community, the author noticed something strange, that when they would get together and sing in their leisure time, the songs detailed how their forefathers were dangerous criminals and how the Salvation Army had worked tirelessly for them for decades, and how the tobacco factory that they were working on had weaned their forefathers away from a life of crime by giving them employment. And these songs were actually taught to them by the Salvation Army. And these songs kind of made them believe that we are criminals, and that it was the Salvation Army that came along and gave us work and helped reform us. But this just seemed curious to the author because she knew that their forefathers had actually been itinerant traders and forest workers, and that their forefathers also fiercely resisted their enclosure by the Salvation Army and their conversion by the Salvation Army. And then you have to ask the question of why. Why has this group of people forgot their past and internalized the kind of Salvation Army narrative about their enclosure? And the reason for this is simple. It's because of the conditions that the Salvation Army created in these settlements. This community had an oral culture and a kind of folklore that was passed down through songs and stories. But under the Salvation Army, community life was totally broken up, and their forced transformation into disciplined workers took a massive toll on their cultural resources. Their nomadic existence was replaced by a settled life, and their extended kinship groups were broken up into nuclear families. Women even lost their egalitarian position and were forced to work as factory workers. And they weren't even allowed to meet in groups larger than 6 unless under the supervision and surveillance of a Salvation Army officer. And they also lost all their leisure time because people were expected to work in the factory for 12 to 16 hours a day. So all they really had was the settlement and the Salvation Army. And if they were to try and escape, they would be apprehended by the police. And these are the kind of conditions that are essential for the telling of tales and singing of songs and the passing down of collective history and memory. So all of these conditions in the settlement caused a massive break with their past. And the myth that these people were dangerous criminals and always had been was deliberately introduced into their oral culture by the Salvation Army. And the tragedy of this is that the oral traditions of this community, once the myth had been introduced, were therefore forced to kind of repeat it and pass it down from generation to generation.